So you find yourself looking for an affordable graphics card and you come across on Amazon one of these things. This is the RX 580 8GB card, and it is sort of new and sort of not new in that it's a new PCB, but the GPUs themselves are no longer in production. So what these manufacturers are likely doing is harvesting GPUs from possibly former mining cards, maybe cards that had died, had memory die, whatever, and they're harvesting these GPUs and putting them back on new PCBs, which is fantastic because what you're getting is a card that still has longevity in it, and you're getting new components in some locations, and you're finding a way to not make these GPUs just find their way to a landfill somewhere. So unequivocally a good thing, and the price honestly is to match. Right now, these things are hovering around $100 on Amazon. Some of them are a little bit more than others. If you go to Newegg, they have some steeper discounts on the ones that are showing up there. I saw one as cheap as about $85 on Newegg. So I'll link some of these down below, but basically these cards are a great way to get into a new gaming PC, but still having the buyer protection of buying something brand new off of Amazon. More on that later. So for today's video, I just basically wanted to figure out, are these things as good as a stock RX 580? And to do that, I have this test bench set up. It's not a high-end test bench. The whole goal of today's video was simply to figure out what kind of performance we can expect from the RX 580 8GB card. This is purchased from Amazon within the last 1 to 2 weeks. So we have a Ryzen 5 4500, 6 cores, 12 threads, nothing big there. We have 16 gigabytes of DDR4 memory running at 3200 megahertz speed. Nothing is really overly tuned here because the whole purview of this video is just to figure out, are these cards worth purchasing? So let's jump into the games. Now for our benchmarks today, we basically ran this card in 2 configurations. The first configuration with the RX 580 8GB card, the Ryzen 5 4500 is the 16 gigs of RAM. Everything was left stock other than the RAM running at its XMP profile to the overclock 3200 megahertz. Everything else was left completely stock as it arrived out of the shipping box that it arrived in. The other way that I ran the actual GPU, I put an overclock on it because what I noticed was happening with the original gameplay that I was seeing at stock was this card was actually running less than, or rather slower than, an RX 580 8GB reference card. So in order to get it performing just a little bit better, I did put a little bit of an overclock on it. Though what I also noticed, this guy does not overclock well at all. In fact, it would often crash if I really pushed it as far as most other RX 580s that I looked up could overclock. Like this thing was not hitting 1400 megahertz under virtually any circumstance I threw at it. So in this case, you may be getting just a little bit of what you're paying for by saving a buck and getting some of these maybe reused GPUs that are quite old. There may have been a little bit of degradation going on with the GPU over its lifespan to the point where it can't quite hit those high clock speeds. And of course, this is just a sample size of exactly 1, so take that with a giant grain of salt as well. Your results may vary. However, I was able to overclock the GPU without really much problem to a target speed of 1314 megahertz. And then of course, in game, you don't always necessarily see the clock speed hitting your target clock speed that you've set in the Radeon Adrenalin software. So keep that in mind as you're watching the gameplay, but we did see some gains on that. With all that out of the way, as far as the actual results go, in CSGO, the average on this system for the overclock was 164, 109 on the 1% low, and the 0.1% low was all the way down there at 39. And I will say, looking at the frame time chart, what I noticed was there were routine spikes in the frame timing, both at stock and overclocked. So that may actually be the CPU holding this card back just a little bit, at least in relation to the 1% and 0.1% lows. Maybe something's going on there with the CPU. But in actual gameplay and in actual practice, I didn't really notice any of those stutters. So if I was a CSGO player at 1440p, high settings, this card would absolutely get me by, and I would feel pretty good about the experience. Moving on to Doom Eternal at 1440p high settings. Once again, a really solid return here from this RX 580. 67 was the average, more than playable, even for a fast-paced title like this. And the better news here is the 1% and 0.1% lows were actually hanging pretty tough there at 51 and 43 respectively. So in other words, not only is this title more than at a playable frame rate for these settings, but you're also not seeing many frame spikes in the frame timing or anything, so everything also comes across as smooth. There's no sort of micro stutter with this gameplay. Moving over to The Witcher 3 medium settings, though, with FSR2 on the balanced preset, the average frame rate was 35, 1% low at 30, and 0.1% low at 28. So this is a slower paced title, meaning that this 35 number, while maybe not optimum, is definitely playable. And because the frame times are actually really consistent, again, we don't see any micro stuttering going on. Though, if you're not happy with 35 FPS with this title, you are absolutely able to knock down that resolution a little bit, knock down settings a little bit, and get higher frame rates. Keeping in mind that this title, since the next gen update, is actually quite intensive on systems. So it's unsurprising that this card doesn't give fantastic results, but it is definitely a more than playable title. And that brings us to our final title of the day, Hogwarts Legacy. Once again, 1440p medium with the FSR2 balanced preset. And this was a title where you definitely benefit from an overclock on the RX 580. The average jumped all the way up to 47 FPS. The 1% low was 39 and the 0.1% low at 31. And what I really liked about this is at 1440p with the FSR2 enabled, you can get very playable frame rates. Once again, this is not an overly fast-paced title, so really you're more concerned about whether or not you're going to see any stuttering in the gameplay. And in that regard, because of those 1% and 0.1% lows holding very strong here, there is no micro stutter to speak of, meaning this title is very playable on this system. So in summary, you kind of get what you pay for with a GPU like this. And to be clear, some of these GPUs seem to be a little bit better engineered and a little bit more premium than others. For instance, the one that I have here actually has an all-metal backplate. Now, it doesn't actually do any additional cooling, but it is a purely aesthetic feature that the manufacturer absolutely did not have to throw in there. On the other hand, this one only has a 6-pin PCIe connector, which at least on paper limits the amount of wattage, though in practice, when I was playing around with the overclock, you could force as much wattage into this thing as the 50% power limiter increase would allow. So the 6-pin wasn't actually limiting anything, though on paper it's supposed to limit the wattage delivered to the card a little bit more than it does. Now, whether or not that actually has an impact on the overclocking of this card, I'm not sure. Ultimately, I didn't get a very strong overclock on this card at all. But if you're looking to run the cards at more or less stock RX 580 clock speeds, you can absolutely do that with these cards. And some of the other manufacturers out of the box, they might run a little bit faster than this one did. This one ran below spec for a reference 580 out of the box, but after applying an overclock, I was able to get it more or less on par with a stock RX 580, which ultimately, for this price tag, is roughly what I'm trying to do anyways. So this is where we kick it back to all of you, those of you out there looking to build a budget system. Is this a card you're interested in, knowing that you get the Amazon buyer protections with a card like this? Whereas if you buy something on a local marketplace, sure, you might save just a little bit of money, but if the card dies in the first 30 days or so, there's likely no way for you to recover the money that you spent on the card, especially if day one it was working. Then the seller is just gonna say something like, hey, it was working when I sold it to you. I can't promise the longevity of a used card. Whereas with this one, if it dies within a couple of weeks, you just return it to Amazon and get your money back, or just get a replacement sent right to your door. And by the way, there are some other cards out there like the 5500 XT that are in a very similar type of a configuration as this RX 580. They're just a little bit more expensive, but if you want something that's slightly better than the 580s, you can go that route as well. Otherwise, if you like the video, give it a like, share, subscribe, comment. All those things are super helpful for the channel. You can follow me both on Instagram and on Twitter at Hoosier Hardware. And as always, I'll let YouTube queue up a couple more videos from my channel for you to watch. I'm Shane from Hoosier Hardware, and I'll see you all in the next video.